Welcome to POTUS 2016, where we keep watch on the Oval Office and pour cold hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Today, Made in USA. In the aftermath of the Trump Carrier Corporation jobs deal, we'll ask some top economists what tax, regulation, and trade policies, if any, would save blue-collar jobs on a large scale. And later in the broadcast, hate crimes. The nativist political climate has triggered more attacks, especially against Muslims. But what kind of personality, in what circumstances, is likely to turn violent? First, though, this week's transition headlines. President-elect Donald Trump has offered Montana freshman Senator Ryan Zinke the job of Interior Secretary. Like Trump, the former Navy SEAL favors mining and logging on public lands, has expressed doubts about climate science, and during the campaign, Zinke called Hillary Clinton the Antichrist. On to Energy Secretary. Trump's pick, Rick Perry. As the longest-serving Texas governor, Perry did champion wind energy, but fossil fuels and fracking were his priorities. His nomination is ironic, since Perry, twice a presidential hopeful, favored shutting down the Energy Department altogether, at least when he could remember his full hit list.
And I will tell you, it's 3 agencies of government when I get there that are gone. Commerce, education, and the, what's the third one there? Let's see.
Yeah, energy. Welcome to the department, Rick. We all forget stuff. What the heck? One thing the Department of Energy staff and contractors will not soon forget is the questionnaire they've gotten from the transition team. It requests the names of people who've attended climate change conferences or embrace things like Obama's clean energy mission. To them, it sounds like a purge is coming, and they are not releasing names. Of course, earlier in the week, Trump named the head of ExxonMobil Corporation, Rex Tillerson, to be Secretary of State. It's yet another discouraging sign for those interested in keeping the Earth's temperature down. But GOP Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham are instead objecting to Tillerson's warm relationship with Vladimir Putin. He made a $500 billion oil deal with Russia, did Tillerson, that was put on ice by President Obama when Putin annexed Crimea. Tillerson favors lifting those sanctions. The 2 GOP senators have also signed on with Democrats to investigate Russian hacking of the November election. Of course, Trump's victory has millions of GOP voters smiling. But one employee of the Book Loft in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, who finds Trump frightening, has chalked this message outside her bookstore. If you can't quite read it, it says, "Post-apocalyptic fiction moved to our current affairs section." All right, let's dig into our first topic, Made in USA. The Trump campaign gained plenty of votes this year attacking globalization, NAFTA, and the proposed TPP trade agreement. Then last month, Trump and his VP-to-be used a $7 million tax break deal to keep 800 Carrier Corporation jobs in Indiana, even while hundreds of others went to Mexico. Gone was Trump's earlier threat of heavy tariffs on imported Carrier air conditioners. Now he was talking carrot, not stick.
I just want to let all of the other companies know that we're going to do great things for business. There's no reason for them to leave anymore, because your taxes are going to be at the very, very low end, and your unnecessary regulations are going to be gone.
Low taxes, less regulation. Would that work? Or should we accept the loss of manufacturing jobs down from 1/4 to less than 10% of the workforce since 1970 as inevitable? To paint the big picture on jobs and globalization, University of Texas economist James Galbraith, author of, among many books, The End of Normal, The Great Crisis and the Future of Growth. To address how tax policies affect job creation and flight, one of the nation's leading tax scholars, NYU law professor Daniel Shaviro, among his books, Decoding the U.S. Corporate Tax. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Professor Galbraith, how would you put the Carrier deal into the big picture? of the decline of the middle class in this country?
Well, we are not going to see a revival of American manufacturing on the basis of one-off interactions between the White House and particular companies. That's something which captures headlines, but it's not the foundation of a larger strategy. So we need to ask, what is the larger strategy? It's apparently not going to be the tariff that was advanced during the campaign.
Well, why not? Because Trump made a point of talking about that tariff, even in announcing the carrier deal, right? He was saying to other companies, and don't forget, if you do send those manufacturing jobs elsewhere, we're going to tax your stuff 35% if you try to bring it back here and sell it to Americans, right?
Well, the answer to that is that there are other companies, manufacturing companies in the United States that export a fairly large part of their product. And so if you impose, tariffs are not a single country's prerogative. Other countries can impose them too. China could shift its purchases of Boeing aircraft to Airbus, for example, and probably would do so. So we are, that's a game which has serious repercussions, and I imagine those are now being taken into account. So that still leaves the question, what exactly do you do? I think that the tax angle is very much on the incoming administration's minds. And what I fear is that by adopting a strategy which focuses on corporate profits taxes and moves toward an increasing sales tax, they're going to create a business environment that will actually be very anti-jobs, and they're not going to get the result that they're promising.
Well, let me bring Professor Shaviro into this on that, because you're a tax expert.
Yeah.
On the carrot side and the stick side, first of all, do you agree with Professor Galbraith that Trump can actually follow through with this threat? I think he hopes the threat will be enough, right?
I think it's kind of like the person who says, I'm not doing it this time, but now I'm going to be really mad, and just you watch me next time. That's not something you can keep saying. I'd have to say I agree with a couple of things that Professor Galbraith said, even though it's maybe more fun in these shows to have disagreement. For one thing, it's not really likely that there's really no good reason to believe that lowering corporate tax rates or business tax rates is going to have a significant employment effect, and also the sales tax aspect. Although I don't think that in the short run, I don't know how much that would matter. One thing economists will tell you is that a sales tax is a wage tax, because people work in order to buy things. So it doesn't kind of matter in the long run which side of the transaction you're taxing. So it's really I don't really see much of a.
Well, let me unpack those things a little bit. Because first, when you talk about lowering tax rates on corporations, that's the carrot, not the stick. That's not the threat of the import tariffs if they move jobs overseas. This is Trump, like he said to the Carrier Corporation, or during that deal's announcement, we're going to make it so profitable for you, American companies, to stay here, because we're going to lower the excessive tax burden. What is it, reducing the corporate tax from 35 to 15%?
Yeah.
Is that the proposal?
Yeah, there's so many proposals, it's hard to be sure which one, but yes, that's one of them. And then there is a version of it in which if you're a partner in a law firm, you get the 15% rate, but if you're an associate or a secretary, you're still at the higher rates. They're probably not making enough to pay 35 today.
That's on individuals.
Yeah.
But on the corporate tax, you said it wouldn't make much difference.
Well, historically,
the line that Trump and many politicians use is, well, obviously there's going to be incentive to start more businesses, to create more jobs, because you're going to be able to keep more money. It might even be the difference between making a profit and not making a profit.
Well, if the tax is measuring profit accurately, you can't be shifted from profit to loss by paying a higher tax rate. It is true, because it's a percentage of your profit. Yeah. It is true that both in economic theory and surely in fact, there is some positive payoff to having the tax rate be a little lower in terms of encouraging more economic activity. Within the ranges we're talking about in the U.S., the effect doesn't seem to be quite that great. And one thing to keep in mind is a lot of businesses are not actually paying a 35% effective rate. That's the line on the statute. But if you're Apple and all your sales in the EU are taxed at zero via Ireland and the Cayman Islands or wherever they send it, you're not really facing that 35% rate today when you're making your choices.
So, Professor Galbraith, if there's not so much old-style manufacturing to save, and the economy is moving to much more of a service economy, and service jobs pay less than the old manufacturing jobs, are we asking the wrong question? Are the politicians talking about the wrong problem? Should we really be talking about getting higher wages into the kinds of jobs that are being created?
I definitely think that is part of the strategy we should have going forward. I've long been an advocate for a very much higher minimum wage. I think that would be a very useful social and economic step. I think there are interesting radical proposals now coming out of the shadows for effectively changing the system very dramatically with a kind of federal job guarantee system. And I think that approach should be explored. It's going to be a long time before it will come to the front of the agenda.
What does that mean, a federal job guarantee?
Oh, right now, we subsidize the unemployed. We subsidize nutrition assistance. We give all kinds of support to people who do not have jobs. But employers want to find people who are already working. And so if there were a system in which effectively you could get a job at a low living wage on demand, then you would reduce the cost of all kinds of other forms of support and maintain what economists call the human capital in the labor force more effectively. So if you're thinking about radical transformations, it's about time to start putting some on the table for the distant future.
So you're talking about widespread workfare? Is that the right word for people who are unemployed or underemployed?
You've got to find useful work for people. But what we need to do is reimagine what kinds of employment the society needs. It's not there will be some manufacturing. That's not going to go away, and it shouldn't go away. But most jobs, as you said, that have been created for the last 50 years have been services jobs. And what we'll need increasingly in the future is employment in sectors which are better served by, for example, nonprofit entities, if not public entities. But certainly the nonprofit sector has a large capacity to absorb labor and make good use of it. So that seems to me to be where we should go on the employment front. But just coming back to the tax question briefly, that tax on sales, which is part of proposals that I've been reading about that are being introduced in Congress, is actually a tax on turnover. So it affects it affects commerce much more than it affects services. And that is why you see a lot more of the businesses being formed in the services sector than in the commercial sector. And so if one were to go the other way, taxing profits, taxing land in particular, rather than taxing turnover and commerce, you would get more commercial jobs. If you look at the tax profile of other countries, the Europeans, which are much more heavily into sales taxes than we are, and which have lowered their profits tax, have a terrible record on employment. It's absolutely catastrophic. We've been doing much better than they have, and I think that comparison really bears study because it really warns against saying, oh, well, the Europeans have a low corporate tax rate. We need to have a low one in order to be competitive.
That's very interesting.
Well,
so for you as the tax expert, how much do you agree?
A couple of things I'll say. First is taxing land is actually a great idea, which was first thought of more than 100 years ago by Henry George. The idea is it's there, it can't go anywhere. So that's actually a very powerful idea. In terms of taxing, I wouldn't maybe be less critical of taxing sales or taxing consumption as long as it's done in a broad-based way. One thing they do in the EU is they have actually larger tax systems that are more regressive than our tax system, but the overall government fiscal system is more progressive because they use the revenues they get from those consumption taxes to pay for benefits, for health care, for housing, for things like education that we don't have in this country.
But weren't you casting doubt earlier on whether going toward a higher sales tax and lower income taxes would be good for the United States?
Well, I think that it would. I was focusing on the question of employment. I don't know that it would actually. The good thing about doing it, I agree. I cast doubt on it from the angle that when you work, it affects your return. If the sales tax affects what you can buy. But if done right, it would tend to bring more capital into the U.S., and I do think that in the long run, that would tend to increase employment and productivity, or at least wages. So that's a good thing. And again, if you think of in terms of the Europeans, we used to think we're doing a much better job than the Europeans. I agree that they haven't done well on employment, but they've created better safety nets than we have for sure.
Professor Galbraith, a brief response?
In parts of Europe, that's true, but in large parts of Europe, those high VAT rates have so destroyed the tax base that the social services can't be sustained either. So it's basically a sinking ship all around. But let me come back to, I appreciate your comment on land. I can only add to that, I can't resist adding, that if we had proper land taxation, we probably would have a different political leadership at the moment. We would not be seeing the top figures in the country coming out of real estate speculation.
Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Galbraith. Professor Shaviro stays with us, and joining us now via Skype, economist, Boston University Law School lecturer, and automation expert, James Bessen. Welcome to the program.
Hi, glad I'm here.
Is automation the real issue? A lot of people say Trump and everybody are talking about taxes and moving jobs overseas, but the real reason for the decline in manufacturing in this country is widespread automation. How much would you say that's true?
I think that is very largely true, especially up to about 2000. In the last 15 years, we've seen a dramatic kick from trade, particularly trade with China. But if you look, over a third of the workforce was in manufacturing shortly after World War II, and now it's 8%. And most of that decline is because of automation. We're simply producing much more per worker. And we continue to up the ante and produce more and more. Manufacturing is very, very productive. Productivity grows, and that reduces the relative need for labor per unit of output. The amount of output's growing, but manufacturing jobs as a percentage of the workforce are shrinking.
I suppose it also probably affects the skill profile of people who can find employment. Is that?
That's, yes. Well, yes, but I think you want to be careful that you don't oversimplify that. It's not, I think we're seeing a real growth in service sector jobs that involve a lot of mid-skill levels. So we're seeing, for instance, in healthcare, the number of healthcare providers compared to doctors has been growing enormously. You're seeing all sorts of levels of nurses and technicians getting involved in healthcare. Those involve mid-level skills. You look at an occupation like licensed practical nurse, or they're sometimes called licensed vocational nurses. Typically, this is an occupation that requires about a year of training after high school. You're seeing employment growing. You're seeing wages growing. They're now earning a solid median level income. Those are real positive signs. And I think the thing we have to think about is how do we create more of those sorts of jobs, and how do we transition people from manufacturing jobs that are being lost to jobs that may be using computer technology or new technologies of other sorts and require different sorts of skills.
Are there enough of those jobs potentially to go around to replace the mass number of manufacturing jobs on which we used to base a, not college educated, widespread middle class?
Yeah, there are. At this point, manufacturing is really a pretty small part of the workforce. It's 8%.
But the middle class is declining.
The middle class is declining for a number of reasons, and some of it is, as you're just seeing, stagnant wages in many of these middle class jobs. There was some loss of, well, certainly we've lost middle class blue collar jobs. There's no doubt about it, and that's the key thing. Now that trend seems to have slowed in the last 5 years or so, 5 or 10 years. We're seeing less regression, and it seems like middle income jobs are back and growing again. There's no doubt that the middle class took a big hit.
I think one of the issues here is that, well, I will see if we agree on this, that the employment ship kind of turns slowly. When you're talking about getting people more skills so that they can get better jobs, that's definitely something we should be trying to do, but it's not something that pays off by the next election, unfortunately, and that's what politicians
Just a quick last word, Professor Bessen. The gentleman nominated for a labor secretary, the fast food executive, has this quote that's been circulating: robots don't ask for raises, robots don't file discrimination suits, robots don't need health benefits. Is there a way to counteract that?
Yeah, in fairness to him, I think that the full context of what he was saying was a little bit more gentle. He was using that as as an argument against the minimum wage. And in fact, there's at least a positive sign that he's in favor of some of these job transition things, job training, and he's provided good job training benefits to his employees.
Okay, we'll see which side of that Andrew Puzder, if he's confirmed, brings into office. Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And now we bring on some additional evidence. Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. As Donald Trump, who's promised to be the law and order president, prepares to enter the White House, some people in America are experiencing scenes out of the film American History X. Swastikas, racist graffiti, Muslim American women having their hijabs yanked by strangers. Real-life scenes, and we warn you this is disturbing, like this.
You and your family, you terrorist. Video all you want. You're an Arab. You're a loser. Stand. Yeah, exactly. Video. What is that going to do? What is that going to do? Trump is president, so you can kiss your visa goodbye, scumbag. They'll deport you soon. Don't worry, terrorist.
How common are such hateful scenes? Well, in the first 10 days after the presidential election, the Southern Poverty Law Center received nearly 900 reports of hate crimes on its internet sites. The center says that references to Donald Trump made clear the election was an inspiration for the spike, which has definitely, however, dropped off recently, they say. The New York City Police Department also reported a 115% increase in hate crimes in the month after the election. FBI data for the year is not out yet, but the agency did report an uptick in hate crimes driven by anti-Muslim crimes in 2015 when the presidential race got going. Trump himself has denounced such actions. How real is the connection between political rhetoric and hate incidents? Who is susceptible to engaging in hate talk or worse? With us to discuss the research on this, Edward Dunbar, professor of psychology at UCLA and co-author of The Psychology of Hate Crimes as Domestic Terrorism. He joins us on Skype from Los Angeles. Welcome to the program.
Thank you, Brian.
How much would you say the political interacts with the psychological to trigger people who are ready to be triggered?
What we're seeing now appear to be more aggressive and violent forms of hate activity than we saw in 9/11, where principally, with some very dramatic exceptions, principally in 9/11 it was speech. We're now seeing and hearing about people that do the kind of work that I do, people that are now being physically assaulted, threatened, in a much more substantial way.
Why the difference, do you think?
Well, I think 9/11, of course, everyone was in a state of shock. We didn't see that coming. The truth, of course, with what we're watching now is a culmination of arguably 18 months of progressive rhetoric and attention to what has been referred to as both alt-right ideology or a making America great again rhetoric. I think people over time have become more emboldened because of this progressive dialogue we're seeing.
So for you as a psychologist, what's the profile of the people who are likely to go off? Do they have other personal underlying issues, anger problems, family problems, whatever?
Sure. Yeah. I've done a lot of work over the last 20 years, both in evaluating and treating and doing research on people who are apprehended for doing hate crimes. And at some point, we should make note of the fact that indeed there are many hate crimes which go unreported, and that's fairly well established by any systematic review of the evidence. Individuals that have been apprehended, prosecuted, and the like. What can I say about them is, first of all, there are diverse types of offenders, like we would find in any kind of criminal infraction, that they are not all a sort of monolithic group. But I would dissuade an interested party in this to say many of them are not people that have a perceived ideology And I think we have to kind of think for a moment that a political belief system and being in a hate lifestyle are not really one and the same thing. So people that do hateful and aggressive actions may have a history of alcohol abuse, may have occupational failures, may have had problems growing up. They may, in many cases, grew up in fairly violent and disruptive homes themselves. And these are impulsive individuals who, in the research I have done, and I've looked at a lot of rap sheets over the years, probably about 50% of these individuals have prior criminal records. So these are not purely ideologues. These, in some cases, are where the crime of hate is sort of a stepping stone up to more serious forms of criminality.
So what can the psychological community and what can the political community do to minimize these actual crimes of hate, even while, let's say, pursuing the political ends that they feel are appropriate?
Yeah, really a very good and difficult question, because if we think of the idea of hate crimes, we are essentially saying, first of all, that bias is now criminalized. And indeed, we have fairly precise ways of talking about bias and crime when they co-occur, meaning just to be prejudiced is not a crime. Even hate speech in and of itself in our country is not a crime. But when these things do co-occur, we're then left with the dilemma of saying, do we punish an individual? And if we punish them, do we incarcerate them? Now, I worked in prisons, and I've worked with a lot of ex-offenders. And if somebody's done a racialized hate crime, they've done a crime that has to do with race or ethnicity, and they are then incarcerated, of course, guess who's the first group that's going to embrace them and radicalize them even further? So I have seen individuals who did violent crimes, were incarcerated, became heroes when they were incarcerated and recognized for this, and came out and became more violent hate offenders. So the punishment angle makes a lot of sense generally, but when we look at hate crimes, we are in some cases forcing the person more into that very lifestyle. A lot of the people with hate crime histories just struggle to get along with people in general. So it's not just per se racially different, but people that just daily walk of life they struggle with. Punishment is not a solution for that. So we then are left with, do we try and do rehabilitation? And there is not a uniform program that exists that effectively has shown that it reduces recidivism. So there's a work in progress.
A troubling and complicated reality in the post-election environment. Thank you for illuminating it for us. And that's POTUS 2016 for today. We're here each week at this hour, keeping watch on the Oval Office and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated political rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.